I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this Common Awards seminar. Just to let you know who I am, I'm Robert Song. I teach Christian ethics in the Department of Theology and Religion here in Durham. Now, the climate crisis and environmental crisis more broadly is for many people the single most important issue we face as a globe today. It's crucial, of course, for Christian mission. It is a crisis that is affecting and will affect disproportionately the lives of the poorest and of women. In a grim irony, it's precisely those who've done least to cause it who will suffer most from it. To help us think through issues of the climate crisis in the context of our thinking about creation and mission, I'm delighted to be able to welcome two guests. First of all, the Reverend Dr. Jione Havea, who's a native Methodist pastor in Tonga and research fellow with Trinity Methodist Theological College in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And he works with the Public and Contextual Theology Research Centre at Charles Sturt University in Melbourne in Australia. Dr. Havea has also been part of the DARE initiative, the DARE initiative at the Council for World Mission, that calls for discernment and radical engagement with issues of justice and injustice in mission. Dr. Havea is co-parent for a 7-year-old daughter. I'm also delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Aruna Gnanadason. Dr. Gnanadason is the national convener of the Indian Christian Women's Movement. She previously served as director of the Global Programme on Women in Church and Society, and also the Justice, Peace and Creation for the World Council of Churches in Geneva from 1991 to 2009. Before moving to Geneva, she worked with the Ecumenical Christian Centre in Bangalore, and then headed the All India Council of Christian Women, or the National Council of Churches in India. She's a member of the Church of South India. And I'm also delighted that we have with us Rachel Murray, who's our British Sign Language interpreter for this webinar. Now, of course, this is a webinar, and you will have the opportunity towards the end. Both our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes each, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Could I ask you to put those questions in the chat bar, perhaps following the presentations, just to save from distraction for our speakers? And also, if I could ask you to keep your phones, your microphones off, and your phones perhaps off throughout. So without more ado, let me introduce you to and welcome Jione Havea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, for the welcome, and thanks to Eve for the invitation and for members of this community. First of all, my apologies, Rachel. I needed to pay respect in my native language. I am coming across to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, in a cluster of islands now known as Australia. This is part of the Oceania that colonizers call Melbourne, Australia. This invitation has given me an opportunity to invite you to a conversation. And the conversation is on the place of the Bible in and around climate matters. I've done several ecological readings of selected biblical texts, but this is an opportunity to think broadly about the Bible in relation to climate justice. For me, it's an important subject, because as Christians, we, together with the Muslims and the people in the Jewish faith, we are the so-called people of the book. And the Bible, in our case, as Christians, the Bible shapes our communities. The Bible shapes how we think, how we behave, how we relate to one another, how we imagine God, and how we relate to creation as well. So it's important to think of how the Bible may help us engage with climate justice or climate injustice. So in the context of climate crises, this presentation invites conversations on the ways that we read the Bible and the readings that we favor or disregard, or the texts we ignore because of our own interests. How has the Bible contributed to climate crises? Or how has understandings of the Bible contributed to climate crisis? Those are my questions. How might the Bible shape our response to climate crisis? How might the Bible be read so that it advocates climate justice? So that's a cluster of questions around which I will offer some thoughts tonight or this morning, as in your case. Is climate change in the Bible is probably a question that most people will ask, since this thing, climate change or climate trauma, is a new phenomenon. Does the Bible have anything to say about climate change? Because this is a new thing, with new concept, new name, new label. And what I'm gonna do first is to offer you what I call a native explanation for climate change. Most of our people don't try to understand the science, that is the European, Western, white science. But we think of our experience from our own science, our own native way of thinking. And this is my attempt as one native to try to imagine what climate change means. It's quite obvious to us who, well, I live in a big island now in this land known as Australia. But it's quite evident to islanders back in Tonga, where I was from, and neighboring islands, that the islands are heating up. The islands are heating up. And we know that from our plantations. In the past, we were able to plant yams and taro and cassava and not need to water them because the island had enough moisture in the ground to be able to provide what the plantations need. Nowadays, in the recent past, we see that it's drying up. The land itself is drying up because the island is heating up. We also experience weather patterns that are getting to extreme. Before, in the case of Tonga, before 2017, our biggest cyclone was in 1982, was Cyclone Isaac, and then in 2017 we have been having Category 5, 4, and 5 cyclones. So we know that that the heat, and this is a native way of explanation, that the heat in the land is affecting the heat in the sea. And in the sea, for us as natives, we see that as like the pot that brews up the storm that comes onto the land. So the land and the sea are completely connected. And the wind, because the land is where we live, the sea is where the heat from the land goes into the sea and brews up storm that becomes the wind and comes back to the island, and as well as continues on the sea. So from a native perspective, these three things, land or island, sea or moana, and wind or sky, are all connected. We can't think of the sky without also thinking of the island and the sea, because they are all connected. And the thing that connects all of these three spheres, or these three horizons, is what we call the underworld. The underworld is what moves or connects these three spheres of sea, land, and sky. And I'm presenting that as a native way of thinking, that we are always connecting things. Now, I'm saying that it is a native way of thinking, but I see similar ways of connection in the Bible itself. And this is where the Bible becomes a helpful way or helpful text for thinking about climate justice, climate change. So I'll give an example from the text here in terms of Genesis. So this is the Genesis 2 text that most of us are familiar with. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. In other words, creation had not started, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. So that's the problem. Number one, God had not sent rain, and there was no one to. It's easy for me as a native to see the connection here of the land and water coming from the underground. The Lord had not caused it to rain, and earth did not wait for God to send rain. Actually, earth brought a stream from the underworld. And out of the underworld and the earth came water that allowed the creation to be started. So it's quite obvious for me with my native orientation to see the connections. Yeah, I mean, the narrator said, oh, the creation did not start because God had not sent the rain. And the solution did not come from above, did not come from God. The solution came up from the underground. The solution came up from earth. So earth, in this native way of thinking, has potential, has the power to create. And it's a kind of creation that connects these horizons that I had mentioned earlier. So this is Genesis 2. It's actually the same thing in Genesis 1, that the waters have the energy to create, and that creation is from below. And I've used this verse 20. And God said, let the waters bring forth. God did not create. It's actually, God is almost like an announcer or an MC or conductor who said, okay, the waters, let you bring forth. And then the waters brought forth life. And then later, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind. And then the earth let those creatures come out. So in Genesis 1, as it is in Genesis 2, the earth and the waters are creative forces that created or co-created with God. Now, this is a native way of reading. Now, when God eventually said, oh, let us make God, let us make humans in our image, guess who were the co-creators? In the native reading, it's earth and the waters. And it quite makes sense that God made humans in the image of the creators, because at the end of life, we all go back to earth and the waters go back to the water. So in a native reading, we see the connection between these horizons or spheres of life. Let me go back to native thinking around climate change. Because of the interconnectedness, it's the natives will quickly go to ask the question, who is responsible for what's happening? Who's responsible for what's happening in the sea? Who's responsible for what's happening in the sky? Who's responsible for what's happening on the land? And for us, we can't say that the land is the problem. We can't say that the sea is the problem, independent of one another and independent of us as islanders. We are responsible, for we are the ones that cross these different spaces. Now, is there climate change? Is climate change in the Bible? Probably not, because we don't have that label, climate change, in the Bible, but there are evidences of things that we associate with climate effect. There are famines. It's quite interesting that in Genesis 12, God said, come, go, and I'll show you this land. And then they arrive in verse 5. And then 5 verses later, there's a famine. This land, so-called land of the promise, flowing with milk and honey. 5 verses later, there's a famine. And famine is associated with drought. And drought is, according to climate change theories, is explained in terms of the warming, global warming that's happening. Well, maybe they didn't call it climate change, but there's the effects of what we call climate change in the Bible. Extreme weather. Genesis 6-9, the flood. You're all familiar with that. Jonah 1, the storm, and there are other storms in the Bible. And the question in modern day climate change debate is who is responsible? And you have some really smart I'm being ironic, really smart leaders of the world saying that we are not responsible. Now, for natives, that's really an easy question to answer. We are responsible because we are the ones who provide the connections. So what do we do then with climate justice or climate injustice? How do we use the Bible to help us deal with these troubles that we are facing? One of the problems with people who read biblical texts is that they hold on to one claim or one assertion and don't look at what might be undermining it or challenging or countering it or, at the other side of the text. So let me use a few examples here. Genesis 1, you're familiar, and a lot of people have made this claim that this is what humans were created for, to have communion. Have communion, but also to have dominion. Let them have dominion over. This is Genesis 1. Lynn White Jr. had the historical roots of our ecological crisis, had used this text as one of the reasons or causes of climate change. So this is the assertion. Most people don't then read the countering. And this you find in Genesis 2, verse 4. There was no creation because there was no rain, as I just explained, and there was no one to till the ground. So in Genesis 1, humans are created to have dominion, to control, to overpower. Genesis 2, humans are created in order to till, to care, to look after Earth. So you have the problem in my reading is that some people hold on to one and forget the other, and some hold on to the other and don't have room for the first. So the challenge is to be able to see the relation between these assertions and counter assertions. Another example of this countering voices. God said, okay, come, you're familiar with the story of the garden. You can eat whatever you want to eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. And then the serpent was wise enough to teach the woman, saying, and then the woman figured it out. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. See, a lot of readers condemn the woman for being disobedient, but they don't see the wisdom in what the woman had found. God only spoke about knowledge of good and evil. The woman saw that this is a source to make one wise. They're speaking in different levels. So the woman was not disobedient, if you can make that argument, but was realizing that there is a good thing in this particular tree. So in that regard, the problem there is that God forbid the woman and the man from having something that was good for them. Another example of countering. In Genesis 3, God this is part of the curses the ground because of you. This has been misunderstood as the curse of the man. But it's not the curse of the man, it's the curse of the ground because of the man. Anthropocentric readers find this problematic because they see it as the hard labor. You are going to labor, but not be successful. The problem there is that we don't see it from the perspective of the earth, that the earth is being cursed, not to do what it was supposed to do. That energy that I spoke about, to bear fruits, is cursed here by God. And guess what? A few verses later, Cain came along and he brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Imagine that. God said, no, this is not going to happen. You are going to do your plantation, but only thorns and thistles you are going to produce. And then Cain shows up, this young man shows up with fruits of the ground. If I was God, I would be annoyed because I have cursed the land. And how dare this young man shows up and showing that he can break the curse of the land. So you have the countering voices that coexist next to each other. And the challenge is to be able to allow these countering voices to speak up. Here's another countering voice. God said in Genesis 12:1, "Come and go, I will show you. I will show you this land." And in verse 6, just 5 verses later, when Abraham arrived at the land, the Canaanites were in the land. So that the narrative remembers that this is a story of colonization, that God said, "Come." And theologians have misunderstood this as about being a story of the promise. It's not a promise, it's God saying, "Come, I will show you the land." God did not give the land, it's us who make that claim. I see I'm running out of time, so I'll quickly conclude here. The countering voices that we hear in these illustrations that I've shown reveal that God is not in control of creation. Since the beginning, God is not in control. In the garden, God was not in control. It's us humans and readers who make God in control when the narrative does not. Humans have been and are in charge. And I go back to my native question, who is responsible? According to my reading of Genesis 1-4, humans are and should be responsible. And because we are not being responsible, that's why we have injustice in terms of creation. Robert, I think I'll stop there because my time is up. Thank you.
Jione, thank you so much for an extraordinary, thought-provoking and interesting reading of Genesis, which will certainly make me go back and have a much closer look than I've done. So thank you very much indeed for that. And I'm sure this will be true for many of us. I'd like to turn now very much to Aruna Gnanadason. And Aruna is going to speak also to us for 20 minutes. And if I could also ask people towards the end of her presentation to start putting questions, comments in the chat for us to take in the question time afterwards. But Jione, thank you very much. And now Aruna, thank you.
Okay. Let me also begin by a deep word of thanks to the organizers of this webinar, and particularly to Eve, who I'm meeting after a long time, and friendship, ecumenical friendships follow us everywhere. And it's wonderful that you remembered me and invited me for this. My presentation is a slightly different take from what Jione did, because what Jione has done, in fact, for us is to lay the theological or the biblical foundations for us to even have such a conversation. And now I give you the example of India to show you just how disobedient humanity has been in following what God wanted for the earth. India at the moment is walking very swiftly in this competitive world of becoming a developed nation. This is its goal, to be finally called a developed nation and not a developing nation. And this drives every policy, every political program, and all those who are controlling power. This is their primary focus. And in this process, we are millions of indigenous peoples, or the natives, as Jione called it, or as we call them, the tribal populations, are losing out. They're losing their homes, their lands, they're being pushed around, they're losing their cultural roots with the land, and therefore their ability to protect the land. They have it innately in them, the impulse to take care of the land, and that is being broken, and therefore the whole country is in the mess that it is in at the moment. So the ruling parties, the people in power, are persuading the middle and upper classes that this is the development that is going to bring us to this promised land of being a developed nation in the world. And therefore they woo this section of the people and continue to stay in power so that they can continue on this reckless path of so-called development, very short-lived policies and programs to do that. And you see all over the world, all over India, the denuding of forests, destroying of green stretches, digging into the mountains, polluting waters at an unsustainable, absolutely unsustainable pace. And of course, in the process, taking away the life and dignity of millions of people. It's interesting the role women have played throughout Indian history in being at the center of the protection of the land. Right from prehistoric times when women clung to trees to protect them from the axes of the king. From that story in the Himalayan region and down to the very present, we have seen women-led movements trying to protect the earth. I want to speak of just one of them, and this is the protest against the setting up of a nuclear power plant in my own state, the place where I come from right now. And there has been a very strong and concerted campaign, largely women-led campaign against the nuclear reactors. That which began around in the 70s itself, the movements against the nuclear reactors increased in vehemence around 2012 when the first reactor was fueled. The Guardian has given some beautiful stories recording the voices of women in that region and how much they know about what is happening. These are illiterate women, village women, who know so much about what is happening to them and why they feel it is so important that as women they should protect the earth. Now, of course, India says that it has to develop its energy needs. You know, just now, there, right as I'm speaking to you, there is a coal shortage. And I was told about 70% of India's energy needs are still driven by coal. And therefore, when there is a shortage of coal, the whole country could, they have claimed, go without electricity. But only USA and China are countries which use more electricity than India does. So now the search for clean energy has been such a small part of the agenda of the government. And they claim that if they produce nuclear power, then the energy needs will be met. But there's enough proof to show that what they're producing through nuclear energy is such a small percentage of the energy needs, which largely goes into industry and continues to pollute as much as it does. But many countries in the world, Canada, UK, USA, Australia, Japan, have all been interested in developing nuclear energy in India. And they are rapidly coming in and taking over. when President Obama was visiting India a few years ago, he signed a deal making it limiting the US's legal liability in the event of an accident, a nuclear accident in the place of production. So they're protecting their own interests, but yet wanting to produce this in India. And the women, I have spoken to some of the women in the area where this whole activity is happening. They know very well the damage that the nuclear reactors will cause to their families, to their children, to their livelihood and everything. And therefore, they're very strong in their protests. One of the ways in which women and men have protested against the nuclear reactor is by standing in the water, in the sea. This is on the sea, on the coast. And women have stood in the sea for days on end, protesting against the nuclear reactor. Of course, the nuclear reactor did come up and it is working, and the women's voices were drowned in the sea. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the church and how it has reacted to the environment. The history of India shows examples of the negative role played by Christian missions in undermining the value and sacredness that indigenous populations attach to the earth. Colonialism and the desire to develop nations, which had led to the conquest and occupation of these lands, was very much focused on the extraction of the resources and the wealth of the colonized nations. And India is no different. And they closely linked that to a theological understanding of what their role was when they civilized nations. And unfortunately, such an ideology persists in the churches today, in the present day Christian churches in India, because we have lost our links with the earth and the people of the earth. Whereas ecofeminism recognizes that the protection of the earth is a vital role for the church to play. And therefore, ecofeminists are stressing this through their theological voices and through the voices that they are raising in the country. We recognize, ecofeminism recognizes that the protection of the earth is closely linked with other systems of injustice and discrimination. The institutionalized poverty that we have in India and other forms of discrimination against the Dalits who are the lowest caste in the caste hierarchy of Hinduism, and the indigenous peoples, are how much they're denigrating to humanity and particularly to women in these communities. Feminists have recognized and are speaking out very strongly against. We recognize that there are what we would call traditions of prudence in the way in which the people of the land, that is the indigenous peoples and the Dalits, have lived with the land. And we lift up those voices in our theological responses, not often heard very well by the church. So it is important for us to recognize the ambivalence of Protestant Christianity in India and some of the mistakes made by Christianity's mission history, which literally dismissed customs, practices, and the spiritualities of indigenous peoples in derogatory ways, labeling them pagan, animistic, etc. In recent times, indigenous theologians in India have begun to interrogate that history and some elements of Christianity that subvert environmental goals. Bharti Longchar is an indigenous theologian who has written extensively on this. The urgency of the task to do something about the environment cannot be underestimated. And I'm not reducing it only to the question of climate change, because in India, I believe that all forms of environmental damage are deeply interlinked with the lives of the people, and particularly Dalit and indigenous communities and the women of those communities. So I don't want to pick up only one outcome of the climate denigration in India. I believe that the epistemologies of these communities, who we could call the subaltern communities in India, is very important in our theological understanding. And it's important that theology, as we have known it, take more seriously what is happening to the earth and to the peoples of the earth. We need to find new ways of relating to each other and with creation. Theology has to move us into that realm so that we don't only speak of what is happening to humanity, but to all of creation. So we need new models of relationship, which are not hierarchical, which do not place, of course, men at the pinnacle and all other creatures right coming downwards, but recognize the interrelatedness and interlink of everything on this earth. We need an ethic of eco-justice to be the frame of our reflections, our theologies, because it is so important that we speak from a justice perspective. Indigenous women have often talked about the radical relationship between their bodies and the body of the earth. Therefore, for them, talking of the earth as mother is a very natural thing. It is not something contrived. Even absolutely illiterate indigenous women will speak of the earth as mother in a most natural sense, because they see this link very much. I'm jumping through some because I don't want to take too much time. We need more, we need, for the most importantly, when we speak about the environment, we speak of an eco-just environment. Eco and justice have to go hand in hand. We cannot speak separately of these things. And we very often speak of the environment and forget that if we don't speak of justice to the people of the earth and to the earth itself, then our speech is very limited. And we have to, it's not from individual actions as good Christians that we are going to protect the earth. It's when we relate our history as Christians in India with its political dimensions, that of the political dimensions of mission history, that we can offer some alternatives to the situation now and where Christians are in all these questions now. It is important what the Indian theologian George Zachariah says. He says that it's not about not being anthropocentric. I have often been told, I guess you're talking about androcentrism. And I say, no, I'm not talking about androcentrism. I'm talking about anthropocentrism, because it's so important for us to recognize what we as humanity have done to the earth. And it's not men and women, it's all of us together. But at the same time, George Zachariah says we need a little bit of anthropocentrism, because if we are to recognize the value of people's movements to protect the earth, and every one of the movements, wherever there is a threat to the earth, it is the people, indigenous peoples, the poor, Dalits, and particularly women who have come forward and are at the center of movements to protect the earth. And therefore, if we don't recognize their agency to protect the earth, there is anthropocentrism that we need to uphold, because it is their actions that are protecting the earth. I will stop now, and hopefully out of this little bit garbled presentation, you can find some meaning.
Aruna, thank you so much just for some very, very interesting and helpful reflections, I think, all over the place for us. And particularly interesting talking about what you talk about subaltern epistemologies and what you say about anthropocentrism as well. Again, coming at some of these questions from directions that one might not have expected. So that's also just very interesting. Can I please invite anyone who wants to ask questions, please to put them in the chat box now, and we'll happily take those. Let me just start off while people are putting questions into the chat. If I ask both Aruna and Jione, where would you find sources of hope at the moment? Of course, in the current situation, hope for many people seems to be in short supply, and I can only speak for people in this country. There is, I think, even if people don't articulate it very well, just a deep sense of we don't know where it's all going. We don't know where we can now find hope, because we have put our hope in material and economic progress, and that's now no longer looking as though it's going to be so straightforward. Where would you look for signs of hope? Perhaps Aruna, perhaps.
I mean, I just see it in these people's movements, particularly where women have taken it on themselves to, it's amazing the kind of courage and determination women, poor women in our many parts of India. I gave you just one example of one struggle. There is the struggle against the Sterlite factory, which is Vedanta, the British company, which is exploiting one section of the people somewhere, and there are nuclear reactors in other parts of the country. And the big dams and what they have done to the people in other parts of the country. And everywhere, it's largely indigenous people centered and women centered. These movements, because it's almost as if it's an impulse where we have to protest. We cannot allow this to happen to our land. And it's a genuine belief that if they are left alone, the land will be protected. This is their belief. And therefore, it is the hope, really the hope, because we cannot place any hope on our governments, which are in the hands of big business. And now, I mean, recently, our government has taken this decision of what they call monetization. So they are not selling the national treasures, but they are leasing the national treasures to big business. And you can imagine what's going to happen and when it comes back, in what condition it will come back, because they are only interested in making money out of it. So the government has given up its responsibility to protect the things of the earth and to leave a heritage for our children by handing it over to big business and just watching, and we are watching our country literally fall apart. But it is people who have continuously protested, and I can't tell you how proud I am of women in India, the very poor, who are at the middle of all the protests.
Thank you. That's that's wonderful to hear. So, Jione, your own views on where we can find sources of hope?
Yeah, I agree with Aruna on the people's movement, people's power. Unfortunately, there are some places in the Pacific, in Oceania, where if the projection comes through, there's no hope, because in 2050 it's going to be game's over. Maybe hope is not the appropriate word, but there's some joy for these people, and I'm speaking of places like Nauru, not Nauru, Tuvalu and Kiribati, and the joy is in their being able to see things differently now, coming to terms with the fact that the sea is going to continue rising, and by 2050 their islands are going to disappear or it's going to drown. But the joy is in being able to shift their ways of thinking, and I'll use the thing of the Bible. Up to 2019, I've only been hearing of the rainbow faith. God is not going to let us drown. In 2019, I began to hear from both Tuvalu and Kiribati, maybe we've been focusing on the wrong text. Let's move out of the flood story. Let's go to the Exodus. The Exodus is a problematic text for liberation theology, but it gives them some kind of hope that if they can migrate, if they can move away from this empire that is going to sink, namely the land. So maybe there's that hope there, but I'm using the word joy because they can also, it's an opportunity for them to look at the Bible differently. They haven't quite acknowledged that they have been misled into focusing on the flood story, but some of them are realizing that they've been working with the wrong text. So hope, joy, there's some combination there.
It's a lovely thought. So joy as the aim, perhaps, rather than hope as such. It's very, very nice. Here's a question from Graham Rutter. What would you like to see the Western Church, Western theologians doing from how you see things? So that's a question, how you see the Western Church and Western Christian thinkers. What should they be concentrating on? Jione, perhaps.
I shouldn't say anything about that question. I mean, you guys figure it out for yourselves.
Okay.
This is part of the problem with colonialism is some people telling others how to think. So as a native person, let me speak of our churches, or our churches in the Pacific. We need to look at the world differently. We need to look at scripture differently. We need to look at theology differently, and to value, and that's why I use native, to value our native wisdom. In the recent past, there's a strong push in theology, and I'm guessing it's true everywhere, to contextualize. And in our context, it's contextualizing thoughts that have come from the West. And because our theology, we were told in theological school, don't do this indigenization thing. That's the sin of theological education. But we are beginning to see that there's some value in our native ways. And I use native intentionally because even our people don't like to be known as natives. There's something shameful about being native, thanks to the missionaries. They came to and call us savages and so forth. So it's a way of appreciating who we are. So if we in Pacifica and in Asia can begin, I mean, what Aruna was talking about with the indigenous people appreciating their own wisdom and courage, then maybe that can happen in the West as well. But I think that's for you guys to figure out.
Thank you. So
If I could
turning the
add,
task back to us,
Robert.
thank you. Aruna.
I mean, I would say that as far as the women are concerned, I very strongly believe we already have quite a strong global movement of women who have almost similar concerns. Of course, our entry points may vary. So I believe in that. I believe very strongly that as a global movement of women, we can bring change. We can offer alternatives to each of our own contexts, inspired by each other. So I put a lot of faith and hope in that. And I believe there is joy in that, certainly, when we come together as women and think together about these things.
Great, thank you very, very much. We've got another question here from Dennis Walsh. As capitalism is implicated in the climate crisis, are eco-theologians suggesting alternative economic models? So for many people, of course, and we've seen this in both your presentations, the climate crisis is clearly very implicated with the way that the world economic system runs. And you both talked about the way that business, for example, takes over things and runs things in its own way and so on. Does that suggest that there's a need for alternative economic models? And if so, do you see ones that are particularly helpful? Perhaps Aruna.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some efforts by the ecumenical movement, certainly from the World Council of Churches, but also from movements like the Oikotree movement, where there are discussions about everything, on alternate economy, challenges to the international financial architecture. So there's some very creative and powerful things coming out. And if we could, those with a little bit of power, if we could use our power to ensure that every theological student has access to that thinking. And it's not just those of us who are engaged in the ecumenical movement who can think in these ways. If we could influence our theological faculties and systems to bring in those kinds of alternate voices into the curricula and into the education, I think we may bring change.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, and I think works with a lot of things that are currently going on in curricula, hopefully around the West, but I've seen some of. Jione.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Aruna, and thanks to Dennis. This is a great question, and I don't know of any eco-theologians or biblical scholars who's able to propose an alternative economic model. But if that was possible, that would be great. And I'm, if some of the people in the audience might know of a suggestion, but we are so controlled by this capitalist system that it's hard. I mean, it'd be easy for me if my island will let me just go back to the island and just go native and to live. But the world is a lot more complicated than just, our island way of life, going back to the land to live in it. But if it was possible, my gosh, that would be great. A new world is possible. We all hope for, but whether we can have a new economic system, that is I think one of our biggest challenges. And like at the moment with COVID, with COVID-19, and everybody's wanting to go back to the old normal. It's pretty much going to that capitalist system. And that capitalist system has always been there, even throughout the pandemic. So I think this is a great question. I'm sorry. Yeah, if that was possible, maybe Dennis knows a system that we can move into, because part of the problem is some change can take place in a little island in the Pacific. Say for example, Tokelau, who is completely green energy, but nobody pays attention to it because it's only 1,000 something, number of people. They, in an island like that, they can change the economic system. But outside of Tokelau, it's a much bigger world. Maybe India can do this, because my wife is from India, and we have this joke that even if you go to the moon, there'll be Indians there. So Indians are everywhere. Maybe the Indians can change our economic system.
We're good colonizers, Jione.
But if that was possible, Robert and the audience, that would be great. Yeah.
It's interesting because, of course, all eyes at the moment are on COP26 in Glasgow. And in a sense, what I'm hearing from both of you is that's really not the place to be looking. If we're looking for hope, we should be looking probably in some other places. So thank you very much. If it's all right with both of you, we may just go over the hour. If you've got a few more minutes.
Yeah.
And we've got a good number of questions coming in. I wouldn't want to lose. We won't be able to take them all, but I would like to take one, two more. Here's one from Francis Clemson. What might we draw from scriptural texts that speak of God and non-human creation in relationship in ways that don't include or don't rely on humanity? And she refers to passages like Job in Job 38, where non-human creation praises and speaks to God without human beings being part of the interaction. So it's a question, where might we look in scripture for examples of interaction between creation, the created world, the non-human world, and God, which don't involve human beings? So in other words, in a sense, taking human beings out of the equation at that point. Any suggestions from either of you? Perhaps Jione, since you mentioned some scripture references.
Another great question. And I'm sorry, I'm not dodging questions. It's just that it's also difficult to answer. But let me offer a suggestion, and that is to look for places where the material world have capacities as we do as humans. For example, one of the things that I've done recently is on the story of Jonah. And Jonah there was a big storm, Jonah got into the boat, and the text in the Hebrew text, it says that the boat thought about breaking up. So the material world have this capacity to think. So if we are able to recognize that and see that, then maybe we can have a different way of thinking about this world that not only can think, but we are dependent on that world. So that's the best I can offer at this point, but it's a great question.
Aruna, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, no, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I won't try that, but I would just go back to say, I see in a lot of the way in which indigenous people in my country relate to the earth, to the things of the earth. There is a sort of, how could I say, the recognizing of the spirits, the spiritual in the earth is so, it's so warm and strong and hope-filled that I feel that we should trust that. Really, that's the thing I'm coming back to. We have so much to trust in the way in which they relate to the earth. And that's why wherever they have been, the earth has been beautiful. And then the rest of us have trampled into it and destroyed it. For instance, there are what are called, what are they called? Sacred, can't get the word, sacred sites, which, sorry, I'm not getting the correct words, which indigenous people have all over the country. These are actually small areas where you get the most rare and precious herbs, and which have just been allowed to grow without any human interference, and they attribute the presence of God there. And they have been just protecting those sacred sites as for the presence of God. But unfortunately, we see it for its financial possibilities. So we trample into it, take out some of those supposedly to produce medicines, and we disturb the spirits, if I could say it, as they would say. This is what has happened here. So I feel that that has so much of meaning, more than a Christian way of looking at God as sitting somewhere out there and occasionally, being good to us. And for us not to recognize that God is everywhere in everything, and therefore step carefully. Don't step on God. Simple wisdom as that.
Thank you. Very good. Jione, you wanted to add in something?
Yeah, just something that just came to mind. And we should stop thinking or reading texts with our able bodies, because if we imagine how people who do not have the kind of abilities that we have read text, we might see things differently. Just going back to this question that Francis had raised, and as Aruna was talking, I was thinking about a Bible study that I did in prison, and it was on the story of Lazarus. And so the prisoners, the people in prison enacted the story. And the guy who was playing Lazarus, when Jesus said, unwrap him and let him come out, he was staggering out. He was showing that he's been in this, he was in this grave for 4 days. And when he was unwrapped, he did not have his balance. It suddenly struck on me that when we think of that or read that story, we think, this is Lazarus. Jesus said, Lazarus, come out. And then Lazarus jumped out and ran outside, and not realize that someone who has been dead for 4 days would have a different way of responding. So I think if we, I'm not sure if that's a politically correct way of reading this disability form criticism, is if we can engage with that might help us see how other voices of creation might be able to speak to us. In other words, not just think as humans, but think also as different kinds of human beings. So thanks, Robert.
Thank you. That's very, very, very helpful. Just 1 or 2 people have written in the chat, just give 1 or 2 comments on the books on economics, books by Molly Scott Cato on environmental green economics, and by Kate Rayworth. Also a document from the World Council of Churches. And also something on the Hebrew Bible and environmental ethics. Here's another question. I think probably we will need to make this our last question. This is from Maureen. As humanity has developed, it seems to have lost sight of the connection with the land around them. The green spaces are being swallowed up around us thanks to the greed of many. I'm a proud Scot and would like to know how we can reconnect the communities with the climate and space around them and throughout the world. So this is an issue about how do we reconnect communities and land and the earth and the space in which communities live. So we've talked a lot about interconnectedness. How might one go about that kind of interconnectedness? Jione?
Oh, another tough question. Thanks for these great questions. We have a 7-year-old at home, and our main thing is just to help her, understand and value the need to recycle, to reuse. So she doesn't have this connection to the land. We don't have a land where we can do a vegetable batch and all of that, but she can connect in very simple ways that, trying to teach her that milk comes from the store, but it starts in a cow somewhere. So we may not connect physically, but we can connect through stories, through instructions, and just taking and if I think it goes back to that other question about capitalism. If we are able to break our minds away from the control of capitalism, we might find creative ways of connecting with the land. But for me, this is my plea. It's not just to connect with the land. The land is connected to the sea, to the sky, and to the underground. So you connect to one and realize that you are connecting to this whole system. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Aruna.
Well, I mean, I would say the same for me, coming from a city and it's a huge city, the city I come from. Sometimes we're just seeking green spaces to find some connection, to be with nature. And here too, everyone goes out. But millions of people in my country cannot afford to do that. They live in crowded tenement places, and that's it. Their life is just on that. So we must be careful that we don't make this into something exotic, our relationship with creation, because it is only a privileged person like me who can say, I'm just longing to get out into the greens, or when I'm going out in the car to go through the hilly regions and say, oof, isn't this just so wonderful to be here? Because it is a privilege to even think of that. For most people, their connection with the earth and things of the earth comes through just their grubby lives, if I can put it that way, where they are, the dirt in which they are living. But even there you see these little episodes of, you see young boys playing cricket with what they consider to be a bat, which will be just a piece of wood, and a ball, which is something that they found there. They create some sort of thing out of even that. They take from nature the things of to make their lives better, literally. So I think it's a human instinct to connect with the environment, with the earth. For some of us, it comes easier, and it's something that we can talk about. But for the majority of people in India, definitely, it does not come so easily. So they create, children at least are able to do that, to create some sort of connection.
Thank you so much. That's and thank you to both of you. That's just been a truly, truly wonderful and fresh and really wise set of insights, I think. And we're going to need all the wisdom we can muster as we go forward as Christians, as a church, thinking through and responding to all these massive questions of climate crisis and environmental crisis. Thank you so much for your wisdom and guiding us through. And I wish we could talk for longer. There's much more wisdom we have to learn from you. And if I could just refer everyone back to the books which appeared right at the beginning of the chat by Aruna and by Jione. I certainly will be having a read of those, because I feel as though I've got a huge amount to learn for myself, and I hope that will work through to my own students as well. So thank you very much indeed to both of you for your time and for your wisdom and your good humour. Thank you very much indeed. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eve.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah. Good night. Good
Bye-bye.
morning. Good day.
Bye. Sleep well.
Yes, sleep well, Jione.
Cheers. Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.